Thank you for your time. Thank you for coming here. I disagree with a lot of what you said tonight.
Good. That makes it fun.
I don't believe that being transgender means that you have some sort of mental illness.
Okay.
And I think that the majority of the psychological, national associations would agree with that. And I think that there's a lot of evidence that institutional racism exists, and that it manifests itself in very real and negative and harmful ways.
Okay.
But I don't feel any violence or animosity towards you, and I would say that most of the people that I know might wish that you wouldn't spread ideas. They might wish that you wouldn't spread ideas that they find harmful and negative, but they don't feel any direct ill will towards you in any violent way that they would carry out. So I guess what I've been feeling throughout this talk is kind of this vast mischaracterization of the left as some sort of homogenous, violent, oppressive body. And I think that the majority of the people that I know and the majority of the interactions that I've had with communities on a larger scale have not matched that representation. So I was wondering if you could kind of talk a little bit about the nonviolent.
So there are two aspects in the nonviolence, okay? And I think one you will agree with and one you will disagree with. So the one that you will agree with is the one that you've already agreed with, which is that you don't get to hurt people just because of what they're saying, right? This we all agree with. This is also the distinction. There's a reason I use the word leftist and not the word liberal. I think there is a distinction between people who are liberals and people who are leftists. I think that people who are liberals may disagree with me on politics, but they don't feel that they get to use force to shut people down. Leftists don't feel the same way. So that is a natural distinction. Now here's the part where we'll disagree. I think that if you are seeking to use the government to cram down your particular vision of society on individuals in violation of their freedom, that this is an aspect of totalitarianism. Whether you want to shut me down or whether you want to, let's pretend for a second that I were a baker, and let's say that I'm a religious baker. I'm a religious person, so let's say I were a baker. And let's say that I don't want to participate in a same-sex wedding because I feel that that's sinful in my own religious belief. My belief is that's none of your business. The belief of most people on the left is that there should be legislation that forces me to cater to that same-sex wedding. By polls, this is true. So, now we're getting into dicey territory because now this does implicate violence. It implicates governmentally used violence. So, you can be, I'm happy you're libertarian essentially with regard to my speech. But when it comes to my behavior, you're significantly less libertarian than I am. You can do what you want, I don't care. But people on the left deeply care what I do in my personal life, that they have no right to my labor and they have no right to my services. So this is where the pedal hits the metal in terms of American politics, and this is where the pedal will hit the metal when the government starts getting more and more deeply involved. As far as the institutional racism, all I would ask you to consider, you can believe what you want, but I would ask you to consider this. Shouting institutional racism does not actually combat racism. You have to find individual instances, and you have to show me who the racists are so that we can fight them together. I hate racism. I think it's evil. But if you're just going to say institutional racism every time something bad happens, there's no way to fight it. I need a policy that you're proposing, or I need a person who's actually racist so that we can fight it together, or we can determine whether the policy is good. What I find really problematic is the virtue signaling that I see by so many people on the other side, which is, I don't have to give you the racist, I don't have to tell you who he is or what measures I'm proposing. I just say institutional racism, everybody cheers for me because that's an approved point of view, and now we move on with our lives. You haven't helped anybody, you've just made yourself feel better. If you want to, have her respond, please.
Well, I think that institutional racism in and of itself, first of all, I would say that the majority of the people that do bring up institutional racism do also have solutions as to how to combat it. But I think that it
involve encroaching on other people's liberty. But yes.
Well, I would just say that there is kind of, again, I feel like you're painting a wide and diverse group of people with the same brush and saying that if you can't point to a policy or if you can't point to a person, then you're just wasting everyone's time. And I think that a lot of people are trying to point to policies, and while I think that the idea of pointing to a racist person is fundamentally in contrast with the idea of institutional racism, because institutional racism grapples with implicit bias in the society as a whole, or not like it goes to the machine, but in individuals.
Unless you're connecting that to a policy, it's a cop-out. Because now we're ghost hunting again. If you just said to me, we have a problem in American society, income inequality, right, is a problem in American society. If you just gave me any problem, and I said, well, that's the Bilderbergs' fault, right? That's the fault of the Bilderbergs, right? It's a conspiracy. It's the fault of the Bilderbergs, right? There's all these conspiracy theories about the Bilderberg group. Now, let's say that it's the Bilderbergs' fault, or it's the protocols of the elders of Zion. It's whatever it is. There's some conspiracy out there. You would say to me, that's not useful because what are you even talking about? When you say institutional racism, it's too broad. You at least have to name me the institution. Which one is the racist one? Which institution is racist? Tell me which, so we can fight it, seriously, so we can fight it together. Just shouting slogans like institutional racism it's not effective. Shouting white privilege is not effective. I want to be on your side. I do. I want to fight racists. I think racist behavior is evil. I want to fight it with you. But I can't fight it if you're not showing me what it is. And we have to decide together if the policies you're proposing will alleviate racism or exacerbate racism. And it turns out, I think that a lot of the policies proposed by the left, I think institutional racism is usually a lever for proposing a policy that is actually unpalatable to freedom, and then castigating people on the other side of that policy as being in league with the institutional racism. The policies are either good or bad without regard to words like institutional racism, is what I'm saying. Honestly, I would love to sit down and talk with you for an hour about it because it's a worthwhile conversation, and I think we could actually get somewhere with it. But I think that slogans generally tend not to be particularly effective in getting us to solutions.
Okay.
Thank you. We have time for 2 quick questions.
Okay. I just have one.
I
just want to disagree with Lauren there. I feel a heavy amount of animosity towards you, but thank you for bringing this ignorance to our campus, because I think it's important when you hear people from different sides, and because of the First Amendment, I can say that, right?
Well, thank you.
But I do have a real question in there.
I'm glad, because there was no question mark at the end. This was going to be a real downer.
In your video where you debunk white privilege, you talk about how white privilege is a made-up term by privileged minorities, so I was wondering if you can elaborate on some of the privileges that you think minority groups have.
Okay, so in privileges in law, so when I say privilege, I'm actually going to talk about legal standing. Okay, so affirmative action is a privilege. Affirmative action is a privilege. Subprime mortgages designed to appeal to minority recipients without proper qualifications, that is a privilege. Now, those are a couple examples of privilege. Privilege would also be the police being told that they can't police in communities the same way they would in other communities because they don't understand the problems of minority communities. That's a privilege. By the way, these privileges are not helpful, but these are, as an overall matter, but it is certainly it's very difficult for me to see how it's not a privilege to get a lower score on the SAT than the Asian guy who's living in exactly the same circumstance. He gets penalized 50 points, you get 230 points on the SATs. That is definitionally a privilege. So there's one. Do you disagree?
Yeah, but I don't want to take up everyone's time, so I'm just going to let.
Fact number 1. Transgender is not a disease. This is not my opinion. This is facts from the World Health Organization and the American Psychologists Association. Just like gay people don't have a disease. Fact number 2. Rich kids stay rich, poor kids stay poor. Out of 1,800 billionaires in the world, 12 of them are black. Where you come from, where you grow up, how much your parents earn, whether your parents were married plays a major role in determining where your
is there a
life
question
will
mark at
end
the
up.
end?
Fact number 3, I would just like to remind you that hate speech is not free speech.
Yes, it is.
And my question is, since facts don't care about your feelings, why did you use false facts?
Okay, so none of the facts that I used are false. First of all, yes. No, okay, first of all, would you like the answer? Okay, so the 3 facts you mentioned, you talked about transgenderism. First of all, until 5 minutes ago, the DSM specifically defined transgenderism as a disorder. It defined it as gender identity disorder, now calls it gender dysmorphia, which doesn't even make sense. It says that depression is the actual problem, not the actual gender disorder, which again does not explain why the transgender suicide rate is upward of 40%, and the actual suicide rate for the rest of the American population is lower than 3%. Okay, so that's number 1. Number 2, you talked about income inequality, and you suggested that all wealth is inherited. This is nonsense. According to the IRS statistics, if you are born into the bottom 20% of wage earners in the United States, you will not be one of the bottom 20% of wage earners in the United States. 90% of people will not be within 15 years. There's tremendous wage mobility in the United States of America. Plus, there is not a group of people who just sit at the very top and stay there. People move up and down, in and out of the 1%. 1% just defines the line of income. It doesn't define the people who are in that 1% of income. I've been in the 1%. I've been out of the 1%. It will happen to lots of
of people. People who are older tend to be more likely to be in the 1%. They weren't once in the 1%. What happened? Okay, so that's number 2. Number 3, you say hate speech is not free speech. It depends how you define hate speech. The only speech that is not free speech is speech that overtly defends or pushes violence. Specifically, speech that is generating violence, right? That's the only type of speech that's not hate speech. If I say things you don't like, that's not hate speech. And if you think that it is hate speech, you're a fascist. End of story.
Do you like being offensive?
Oh, please, I am not offensive. I'll tell you, liberals like being offended is the issue.
No.
Documented immigrant who has lived in this nation for almost 22 years wants to, as a sign of my humanity and yours, recognize you and say, can I give you a hug?
No, let's get on with the question.
Okay.
But I wanted to ask you, what's your family's immigration story? Are you a Native American?
Why, yes, I am. I'm a settler. I'm descended from settlers, not from immigrants.
Oh, it's not a Native American.
But
I have a question for you.
It's just an no, if you mean Indian,
if you mean
well, no, but I'm not living in Cherokee Nation, so I am not an immigrant to Cherokee Nation. I'm living in America, which was created by settlers, not immigrants.
I have a question.
But
can I interrupt you for 2 seconds, please?
Yes, the poorest
I have a question. My mom taught me when I was younger, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. And why do you think that it's important? Why do you think that's important to mudsling and have these words that obviously touch the hearts and souls of so many people of America being said when we're taught something different as a child? Could you explain that to me? And why do you think your success is based off of that?
Well, I'm at least talking about policy. You have a position on what people's names should be. Watermelondria. I mean, you'll insult people for their names. I'm talking about a government policy that affects all Americans and immigrants and the people living here, and it's harming our country.
So are you?
So you don't follow it.
Are you
I didn't ask
against?
you okay.
Are you?
Thank you for coming.
Thank you. I'm so sorry that they were so rude to you. You're like seriously my idol now.
God
bless
you. You see, all the pretty girls are on my side. Absolutely not. You are wrong about that, and that is the interesting.
Kill anybody. That's all I'm saying.
No, it's of course it's not every. The point is, you look at it from the other end.
You know, and
When you look at the prison end, and no, it is not true that I'm leaving out race. There is, in fact, I cite a study by the Progressive Policy Institute, a liberal institute, saying that if you take single motherhood out of the equation, the black and white crime rates are exactly the same. So you take everything else out. Single motherhood is not good for children. That is a fact.
What I would like to